La compró por unas cuantas monedas, una casa a la que nadie se atrevía a entrar. Decían que sus paredes habían visto demasiada sangre, que estaba maldita, pero lo que la viuda y sus hijos encontraron dentro hizo que todo el pueblo guardara silencio. Suscríbete para no perderte la próxima historia y comenta abajo desde dónde estás viendo. The rain had stopped before dawn, leaving the valley of San Martin wrapped in a low white mist that clung to the trees and softened the sharpness of the hills. From the road below, one could still see the mansion of Raul Mendoza, standing like a scar that refused to fade, its tall windows black with years of dust, and its walls veined with the stains of forgotten storms. People passing by seldom looked toward it. Some crossed themselves. Others muttered a prayer or spat to the side of the road. It was said that the walls of that place had drunk more blood than the soil could hold, that its marble floors still remembered the weight of the men who had died defending it. Even the birds avoided it. Far down in the town, among narrow streets and the hum of cheap radios, a woman named Elena Cardenas began another day that felt exactly like the one before. She lived in a rented room above a mechanic's workshop where the air smelled of oil and metal shavings, and the floor trembled whenever the engines roared to life. Her husband had been dead for 5 years now, buried under the collapse of a mine in Cerro Azul. His name was still on the debt papers she kept folded inside a tin box beside the bed. She had 2 children, Luis and Isabel, and more bills than days of sunlight. That morning, the landlord's final notice had been slipped under the door. She read it without surprise, only a dull tightening in her chest. Luis, 11 years old, slept curled beside his little sister on a mattress laid across the floor. Isabel clutched the stuffed cat her father had won for her at a carnival once, the toy's fur rubbed thin and gray. Elena stood by the small window and watched the sunrise spill over the rooftops. Somewhere below, a radio was playing an old song about luck. The words meant nothing to her now. On the wobbly table lay a folded newspaper from the day before. She picked it up only to distract herself, flipping through the pages until her eyes caught on a small square of text at the bottom of the classifieds. Government auction, confiscated properties, San Martin Hill Estate. Minimum bid, $150. At first, she thought it was a misprint. The Mendoza estate, everyone in town knew it. They had told stories about that mansion since she was a girl. Secret tunnels, hidden rooms, and the ghosts of men who had tried to steal from the cartel's coffers. No one in their right mind would want that house. But there it was, the number printed clear as day, a single $150. Her fingers trembled slightly as she traced the numbers, and for reasons she could not explain, she tore the notice out and slipped it into her handbag. It was a foolish thought, but sometimes desperation speaks louder than reason. The auction took place 2 days later in a gray municipal building near the courthouse. The air smelled faintly of paper and rain-soaked coats. Only a handful of people had come, some curious, others there to bid on seized trucks or farmland. Elena sat near the back, clutching her handbag, her heart thudding beneath the collar of her worn dress. The auctioneer's voice droned through a list of vehicles, machinery, and confiscated lots. Then he reached the line that made the room stir. Property number 47, residence of Raul Mendoza, Hill of San Martin. Starting bid, $150. The silence that followed was heavy enough to press on her shoulders. The auctioneer waited. Nobody spoke. Nobody even shifted in their seats. Elena could feel the eyes of the few attendees slide toward her, curious and mocking. Without quite meaning to, she raised her hand. The sound of the chair scraping against the floor echoed sharply through the hall. The auctioneer blinked at her, as if doubting what he saw. $150, he repeated. Any other offers? The pause stretched. No hands lifted. A moment later, the gavel came down with a hollow crack that seemed to split her chest in two. Just like that, with a scratch of a pen and a few stamped papers, the poorest woman in San Martin had become the owner of the most feared house in the valley. By the time she returned home, word had already spread. The gossip traveled faster than the buses that wound through the town. At the bakery, 2 women whispered over a tray of sweet bread. "She's lost her mind," one said. "The widow bought the devil's house." At the grocery, men smirked when she passed, and one muttered, "She won't last a week in there." Elena kept her head down. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. She sold her husband's old tools, borrowed a neighbor's truck, and spent 2 days packing everything they owned into a few crates. When she told the children they were moving, Luis asked if the new place was big. "Bigger than our school," she said with a tired smile. Isabel's eyes widened. "Then it must be beautiful." Elena didn't answer. Beauty was not a word that belonged to them anymore. The road to the hill was long and broken, scarred by rain and neglect. The truck bounced and groaned as it climbed through the withered fields. The air grew cooler, and the town vanished behind them like a dream that had already forgotten their names. When they reached the gates of the estate, the engine stuttered to a stop. The iron bars stood high and rusted, chained with an old lock stamped with the government seal. Ivy crawled across the pillars like veins on old hands. Elena got out, her boots sinking into the damp earth. The key they had given her was heavy, its teeth dark with rust. She forced it into the lock and turned until it gave way with a sound that felt like a sigh. The gate swung open slowly, scraping the gravel. Luis and Isabel peered from the truck window, silent now. Beyond the gate lay a garden gone wild, a wilderness of weeds and fallen branches. A cracked fountain sat in the center, filled with stagnant water and the corpses of drowned leaves. Beyond it rose the house, immense and sullen, its walls streaked black by rain and time. For a long moment, Elena did not move. The house seemed to be watching her, the way a sleeping animal watches through the thin slit of a dream. Then she squared her shoulders and called for the children. They climbed down, small against the towering doors. Isabel slipped her hand into her mother's, whispering, "It smells like rain." Elena nodded faintly. "That means it's still breathing," she said. Inside, the air was cold and heavy. The first step echoed like the closing of a vault. Dust swirled in the slanted light that entered through broken shutters. A chandelier hung crookedly above them, its crystals dulled by years of grime. On the wall opposite the entrance, a massive portrait loomed to the face of Raul Mendoza himself, painted in his prime, his dark eyes sharp, his smile small and knowing. They wandered from room to room, speaking little. The living room held furniture draped in ghostly white sheets. The dining room a long table ringed with empty chairs. In one corner, a piano sat with half its keys missing. The remaining ones yellowed like old teeth. Every step stirred the smell of dust and decay. But beneath it, there was something else too, a faint sweetness, like old tobacco or dried flowers. By sunset, they had cleared a corner of the library, where the walls were lined with books swollen by humidity. Elena spread blankets on the floor, lit a small kerosene lamp, and divided the bread and fruit she had brought from town. The children ate quietly, their voices small in the vastness of the room. Luis tried to act brave, saying it wasn't so bad, but his eyes kept darting toward the darkened doorway. Isabel fell asleep, clutching her toy cat. Elena sat awake for a long time, listening to the house breathe. The walls ticked and settled, the wind whispered through the shutters. Somewhere above, something shifted, a slow, deliberate creak that might have been wood, or something else entirely. She told herself it was nothing, that the house was only stretching after its long sleep. Still, she could not shake the feeling that it was aware of her now, that her arrival had stirred something it had buried deep. When at last she stood and walked to the front door, the valley below was drowned in twilight. The town's lights flickered faintly, distant and safe. She placed a hand on the cold wood of the door, meaning to close it for the night. The hinges groaned, resisting as if reluctant to seal her in. When it finally shut, a breath of air escaped from within, brushing against her cheek like the exhale of a living thing. She stood there for a moment, her heart slowing, her hand still resting on the door. Behind her, the small flame of the lamp flickered against the walls, trembling but unbroken. From somewhere deep within the house came a faint sound, a slow, almost human sigh. It might have been the shifting of the foundation, or the whisper of the wind caught between the walls. But to Elena, standing there in the dark, it felt like the heartbeat of something awakening. Outside, the last of the mist curled along the hill, wrapping the house in pale ribbons. The night closed around them, quiet and absolute. Upstairs, her children slept without dreams. Down below, the widow of San Martin watched the shadows gather, unaware that with the turning of that key, she had awakened not just a house, but everything it remembered. Morning came pale and hesitant, the kind of light that looked afraid to enter. It filtered through the shutters in narrow lines, illuminating the fine dust that drifted through the air like ghostly snow. Ellen awoke to the sound of distant dripping, her body sore from sleeping on the hard floor. For a brief moment she didn't remember where she was. Then the smell of damp stone, of age and neglect, returned to her, and she remembered everything. The auction, the long climb up the hill, the sound the house had made when she closed the door. She sat up slowly, rubbing the stiffness from her neck, and looked around. The library was vast and cold. The books around her, swollen and bowed with humidity, their spines cracked and colorless. Her children still slept on the blankets beside her, huddled together under a single quilt. Isabel's hand rested over her brother's shoulder, her stuffed cat wedged between them like a tiny guardian. The lamp had burned out sometime in the night. She reached for the nearest shutter and pushed it open. The hinge screamed in protest, but the light that poured in was clean and sharp, cutting through the gloom. A pigeon startled from the window ledge, its wings flapping against the frame before vanishing into the gray sky. The sudden burst of air felt like a blessing. The room seemed to exhale, as if relieved to be seen again. For the first time since stepping into this place, Elena felt something close to resolve. The house might have been built on fear, but it was hers now. If it was cursed, she would face the curse. If it was haunted, she would teach it to live again. She moved through the rooms with a broom in one hand and a bucket in the other, sweeping the marble floors, brushing cobwebs from the corners, opening doors that had not been opened in years. The echo of her footsteps followed her like a second pulse. Dust rose in golden clouds, catching the light in soft halos. In the dining room, she found a long table surrounded by chairs, each one carved with initials. A ring marked the spot where a glass had once stood, a faint human trace in all that ruin. She ran her fingers over it and thought of the people who had sat there, laughing, arguing, making plans that had all ended the same way. By noon, the children were awake and exploring, their voices bouncing off the high ceilings. Luis wandered through the hallways with the flashlight he'd insisted on bringing from town, his curiosity outweighing his fear. Isabel followed more carefully, clutching her stuffed cat and occasionally calling for her mother when the silence grew too thick. Together they discovered rooms upon rooms, bedrooms with rusted bed frames, a bathroom whose mirror was split by a spiderweb of cracks, and at the end of one corridor, a staircase that led down into shadow. The air changed as they descended, growing colder, heavier. The steps creaked under their feet, each one releasing a breath of dust. At the bottom they found a vast basement, the walls lined with brick and darkness. Broken bottles littered the floor near what had once been a bar. A pool table lay on its side, its felt ripped open like an old wound. On one wall, a row of metal lockers stood with their doors half open, revealing nothing but cobwebs and a few forgotten scraps of paper. Luis ran his hand across the cold surface, pausing at a cluster of small dents. "Bullet holes," he said quietly, his eyes wide. Isabel whimpered, and Elena told him sharply to stop. But even she couldn't look away from the marks. The walls here had stories to tell of men shouting, of gunfire echoing in the dark, of a night that had ended in blood. Then she saw it, a massive steel door set into the far wall, its surface gray and pitted with rust. Faded letters above it read, "Sala de Seguridad." The lock was gone, but the door was sealed shut as though the years themselves had welded it closed. Elena pressed her palm against the metal. It was cold, colder than the air around it. She put her ear to it and listened. There was nothing. No sound, no movement, only a silence that seemed deeper than the rest of the house. She turned away quickly. "Come on," she said, her voice echoing off the walls. "There's nothing here worth seeing." That night they ate in the library again. The air was beginning to lose the staleness of disuse, replaced by the faint smell of soap and dusted wood. Luis talked excitedly about the basement, spinning stories of hidden treasures and secret passages. Isabel was quieter, staring at the dark corners as if expecting something to move there. Elena said little. She had always been practical, a woman shaped by hunger and work, not by dreams or fears. Yet as she listened to her children talk, she couldn't shake the sense that the house was listening too. When they finished eating, the children fell asleep quickly, lulled by exhaustion. Elena remained awake, watching the flame of the lamp tremble against the walls. The house was vast enough to hide anything or anyone. She rose quietly, taking the lamp, and began to walk. The corridors stretched before her like veins, leading deeper into silence. The portraits that lined the walls were dim in the flickering light, faces that seemed to change as she passed. Some were scratched through, others perfectly preserved. The farther she went, the colder the air became. She found herself standing before a door left slightly ajar. Pushing it open, she entered what must once have been a nursery. The wallpaper had peeled from the walls, revealing faint outlines of painted clouds. Toys were scattered across the floor. A wooden train missing its wheels, a ball deflated and cracked by time, a stuffed lion with only one button eye. On a low shelf stood a small frame photograph coated with dust. Elena lifted it carefully and wiped it clean with her sleeve. A man and a woman smiled at the camera, their arms around a boy who couldn't have been older than 7. The boy held a toy airplane above his head, his face lit by sunlight. On the back, written in a child's uneven handwriting, were the words, "Papa says the sun lives under the house." The phrase made her skin prickle. It wasn't the kind of thing a child would invent for no reason. She looked again at the boy's bright face, at the mother's soft eyes, at the man's faint, distant smile. For a moment she felt an ache she couldn't name, a sorrow that didn't belong to her, but to the walls around her. She set the photo back and left the room, closing the door gently behind her. Outside, the wind had risen, moaning softly through the cracks in the shutters. The lamp's flame bent and flickered, throwing long shadows that trembled across the hallway. When she returned to the library, she paused by the window and looked out into the garden. The fountain gleamed faintly in the moonlight, its water stagnant but shining like glass. Weeds swayed in the breeze, their movement eerily slow. For a brief instant, she imagined the place as it must once have been, children laughing near the fountain, music drifting from open windows, candles glowing behind clear glass. The vision faded as quickly as it came, leaving only the reflection of her own tired face in the window pane. The following days were filled with work. She scrubbed the floors until her hands ached, opened every window she could force, and burned old linens to drive away the smell of rot. Luis helped where he could, dragging debris into piles, while Isabel collected wildflowers from the overgrown garden and placed them in cracked vases. Bit by bit, the house began to change. Light found new corners to settle in. The silence softened. Even the constant echo of their footsteps grew less hollow, as if the rooms were beginning to remember the sound of life. But at night, the house reminded them that it had not forgotten what it once was. There were sounds, soft creaks, faint thuds, the sigh of air through unseen cracks. Elena told herself it was only the settling of the walls, the expansion of wood after so many years of stillness. Yet one night, something different happened. She had just drifted into sleep when a faint sound woke her. It was not the wind this time, nor the whisper of the shutters. It was a rhythm, slow and deliberate, like footsteps moving down the hall. She held her breath, listening. The sound stopped, then resumed, closer. Careful not to wake the children, she rose and reached for the lamp. Its light spilled across the room in a trembling circle. She moved toward the sound, her bare feet cold on the marble. The corridor was empty. The portraits watched her with their lifeless eyes. Then she saw it on the floor near the base of the stairs, a trail of small footprints in the dust. They were bare, light, unmistakably those of a child. They led from the stairs toward the gallery wall and stopped there, abruptly, as if the child had vanished into the plaster. Elena crouched, her pulse quickening. The dust was freshly disturbed. She touched the floor. It was cool. When she lifted her eyes, she saw something she could not explain. A thin vertical line along the wall, almost invisible beneath the faded paint. From that line seeped the faintest glow, like a thread of light struggling to escape. For a heartbeat, she thought she saw it move. She blinked, and it was gone. She reached out, pressing her fingers to the wall, but felt only the rough chill of plaster. Still, she knew what she had seen. Something lay behind that wall, something waiting. Elena backed away slowly, the lamp shaking in her hand. The house was silent again, the kind of silence that seemed to listen. She turned and walked quickly back to the library, where her children slept undisturbed, their faces peaceful and untouched by fear. She lay down beside them and stared into the darkness until the first light of dawn began to slip through the cracks. Her mind kept returning to the photograph in the nursery, to the child's handwriting, to those impossible words that now pulsed in her thoughts like a heartbeat. The sun lives under the house. And somewhere deep within her, a certainty began to take root. Whatever those words meant, whatever secret they held, it was still there, buried beneath the weight of time, waiting for her to uncover it. The morning broke gray and silent, heavy with the dampness that followed a night of drizzle. The house seemed to hold its breath, every corner soaked in the smell of wet stone and dust. Elena rose before the children, her mind still haunted by the footprints and the strange shimmer she had seen on the wall. She sat at the edge of the blanket for a while, staring at the faint outlines of the gallery stairs through the half-open door. Luis murmured in his sleep, Isabel's hand resting gently on her mother's arm. The house was quiet, yet it felt awake. She could feel it in her chest, as if the walls themselves were listening to her heartbeat. By the time the children stirred, she had already made up her mind. The mystery of that wall would not let her go. It was no longer just fear or curiosity. It was something deeper, something that pressed at the edge of her thoughts like an unfinished sentence. As she prepared breakfast, the sound of the rain outside slowed to a soft dripping, and a faint light crept into the room. Luis yawned and rubbed his eyes while Isabel, still clutching her stuffed cat, whispered that she had dreamed of voices whispering beneath the floor. Elena forced a smile and told her it was only the wind, but her heart was uneasy. After breakfast, she gathered what few tools they had brought, the hammer Luis had insisted on packing, an old screwdriver, a flashlight with fading batteries. The children followed her as she climbed the main staircase, each step creaking beneath their feet. The air grew cooler as they approached the gallery, the light dimming despite the open shutters. The portraits along the walls stared down at them, the painted eyes catching the light in strange ways. At the far end of the corridor stood the same wall, plain and cracked, yet unmistakably different from the others. The faint line she had seen the night before was still there, running like a scar beneath the peeling wallpaper. "Stay back," she said softly. Luis nodded, his expression caught between fear and excitement. Isabel hesitated, her small fingers tightening around the hem of her mother's skirt. But Elena gave her a reassuring glance. Then she turned to the wall and began to peel away the paper. The old glue released with a sigh, the faded pattern tearing away in long strips. Beneath it lay plaster, pale and uneven, discolored with time. She rapped it lightly with her knuckles. The sound was hollow. Her pulse quickened. Luis held out the hammer. "Let me," he said, trying to sound brave. She smiled faintly and shook her head. "I'll do it." She swung once, the impact sharp and startling in the silence. A small cloud of dust burst from the wall. She struck again, harder this time, until the plaster cracked in a jagged line. The third blow opened a hole large enough to fit her hand. A chill gust of air escaped, carrying with it the smell of iron and earth. She stepped back, blinking against the dust, then leaned closer with the flashlight. The beam caught a dull gleam inside, a metallic edge, rusted and red. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached into the cavity. Her fingers brushed something cold and rough, the shape of a small box. She pulled it free with effort, her heart pounding. The box was iron, its hinges fused with rust, a corroded padlock still clinging to the clasp. Luis bent down to examine it, his eyes wide. "It looks old," he said. Elena didn't answer. She placed it carefully on the floor and struck the lock with the hammer until it snapped apart. Inside lay a bundle of papers tied with a ribbon that had once been black but was now faded to brown. Beneath them rested a leather-bound notebook, its cover cracked, the words Luz de los Caídos pressed faintly in gold. Elena knelt and opened the notebook. The handwriting was strong but uneven. The ink faded. The first page bore a date from 15 years ago, followed by a sentence that made her breath catch. "I built this house on the bones of my fear. Every stone holds something I wanted to forget." She turned the page. The entries that followed were confessions written without apology or expectation of forgiveness. They spoke of hunger, of a boy who had grown up watching soldiers beat his father, of a promise made in blood to never be powerless again. She realized then whose words she was reading. The name signed at the bottom of each entry was unmistakable. Raul Mendoza. Her hands trembled as she turned the pages. The story unfolded in pieces. The rise of a man from poverty to power, the first deals that paid for the house, the first bodies buried because of it. But between those lines of cruelty, there were moments that startled her. Mentions of a woman named Sophia, of her laughter, of the way she believed he could still be a good man. There was love in those lines, fragile and desperate, and a sense of regret that seemed to grow heavier with every page. Then she reached a passage that made her stop. I buried the only sunlight I ever had the day they died. The next entries grew fragmented, as if written in haste or fear. Mendoza wrote of a plan to use his wealth to build a refuge for the children left orphaned by the wars of the cartels. He called it Casa de Luz, House of Light. He wrote about the foundations already built, hidden beneath the mansion, and the papers he had placed within its walls in case he never returned. The final line on the last page was written in a shaky hand. If I vanish, remember that I did not run. I went to make peace. Elena sat back, her heart thudding in her ears. The notebook was not what she had expected. It wasn't a ledger of crimes or a confession for the law. It was something human, something that blurred the line between sin and repentance. For years, the town had spoken of Mendoza as a monster, a man who built his empire on death. But in these pages was another truth, one that complicated everything. Could a life steeped in blood still dream of light? As she pondered, she noticed something else in the cavity behind the wall. The light from the flashlight caught on a larger metal surface hidden deeper inside. She scraped away more plaster until the edge of a small safe appeared, its door sealed, but its hinges rusted. The dial had been smashed long ago. She wedged the screwdriver between the cracks and pried until the frame gave way with a groan. Inside there was no money, no gold, only a few letters, a small tin crucifix, and a child's drawing folded neatly at the bottom. She unfolded it carefully. A bright sun hung over a house drawn in shaky-colored pencil, with a man, a woman, and a boy standing in front, all smiling. At the bottom, in the same uneven handwriting as on the photograph she had found before, were the words, "The sun lives under the house." Her throat tightened. The words felt heavier now, not childish, but prophetic. She looked again at the drawing, tracing the outlines of the smiling boy. The simplicity of it made her heart ache. She replaced the drawing beside the diary and gathered the letters, their paper brittle with age. One was addressed to Sophia, written in the same hand as the journal. "Forgive me," it began. "This house was meant to protect us, but it became a prison. If ever these walls are opened, let them serve a different kind of master. If not by me, then by someone who understands." The air in the corridor felt colder. Outside, clouds had gathered, dimming the afternoon light. She wrapped the notebook and letters in a cloth and carried them to the library. The children followed quietly, sensing her unease. She set the items on the table beside the lamp and sat staring at them for a long while. The words she had read replayed in her mind. "I built this house on the bones of my fear." It felt as though the man's spirit had not left at all, that he was still there, waiting for someone to listen. As evening fell, the wind picked up again, rattling the shutters and stirring the ivy outside. She lit the lamp and turned it low, unwilling to let the dark fill the room completely. The children had fallen asleep on the rug. She leaned back in the chair, staring at the crack of the broken wall across the hallway, now darker than ever in the fading light. The house creaked softly, shifting as if in response to her thoughts. Then she noticed something through the window. A pair of headlights far down the hill, motionless in the distance. The car's engine was idling, a faint hum carried by the wind. It stayed there for several minutes, its lights cutting faint lines across the rain. Then slowly, they went out. The car remained a dark shape against the trees for a while longer before vanishing into the mist. Elena stood by the window long after it was gone, the diary clutched to her chest. The words she had read felt less like history and more like warning. She didn't know what she had uncovered or why it mattered, but instinct told her that someone else did. Behind her, the open safe yawned like a wound, and the child's drawing glowed faintly in the lamplight, its sun bright and defiant. Somewhere in the depths of the house, a door creaked, followed by a sound like a sigh, soft, almost sorrowful, but unmistakably alive. And as the rain began to fall again, whispering against the windows, Elena knew with a cold certainty that whatever lay hidden beneath this house had only just begun to wake. The storm that had swept through the night left the valley drenched and heavy with silence. By morning, clouds still clung to the hills like torn veils, and the Mendoza mansion seemed darker than ever, its wet walls glistening as though the rain had washed away another layer of its disguise. Elena stood at the window watching the mist curl around the gate. The words she had read in the diary still pulsed in her mind, stubborn as a heartbeat. If I vanish, remember that I did not run. I went to make peace. Each line had begun to feel less like a confession and more like a plea. But peace was something the house had never known. When she stepped outside, the air smelled of mud and iron. The path to the gate was slick under her boots. It was then she saw it words scrawled across the rusted bars in thick white chalk. Leave him buried. The message was jagged, written in haste, the letters uneven and angry. For a moment she could only stare at it. The chill that ran through her had nothing to do with the cold. Someone had been here during the night. She glanced down the road, but the morning was empty, the fog too thick to reveal anyone who might have left it. Luis and Isabel were still asleep upstairs. She didn't want them to see this. Fetching a rag and a bucket of water from the fountain, she began to scrub at the letters. The chalk came away in white streams, dissolving into the ground. When she finished, she stood for a moment, breathing hard, the rag hanging limp in her hand. It's just a prank, she whispered to herself, though the words felt hollow. In town, she sensed it before she even reached the bakery. Eyes followed her wherever she went. At the counter, the woman who usually greeted her with small talk kept her distance, setting the bread on the counter without a word. Outside, two men leaned against a wall, their conversation faltering when she passed. She heard one of them mutter something about the widow and the ghost gold. She pretended not to hear. It was easier that way. But by the time she reached the small market, her stomach was tight with unease. The car she had seen the night before returned to her thoughts. Its lights, the engine idling, the way it had lingered before vanishing into the mist. Someone was watching. Someone knew what she had found behind that wall. When she returned home, the house was quiet, the children reading by the fire. She forced a smile, unpacked the groceries, and busied herself with chores. But every creak in the floorboards made her turn. Every gust of wind through the shutters made her heart race. By evening, when the shadows stretched long across the marble floor, she couldn't bear the silence any longer. She lit a lamp and placed it on the table beside the diary, then sat down, staring at its worn cover. She told herself she would not open it again, but the temptation was stronger than her fear. She began with the last pages, the ones she had only skimmed before. There she found something she hadn't noticed, a set of dates, each entry written in haste, as though time had been running out. Mendoza wrote of a lawyer he trusted, a man named Don Alvaro, who was helping him organize the papers for the Casa de Luz Foundation. He had written of bank accounts frozen by suspicion, of police raids that came too soon, and of his fear that the dream of a refuge for orphan children would die with him. The entries ended abruptly. The last page contained only a single sentence. If these walls remain, then my debt remains too. The knock came not long after, a single measured sound that echoed through the hallway. Elena froze, the diary still open in her hands. It came again, softer this time. She stood, her chair scraping against the floor, and walked slowly toward the door. Through the glass, she could see the shape of a man standing on the porch, his outline blurred by the dim light. When she opened the door a crack, the smell of rain swept in. "Señora Cardenas?" the man said. His voice was low, cautious. He was older, his face lined and pale under the brim of his hat. He held a small leather briefcase against his chest. "My name is Don Alvaro. I believe you found something that belonged to my former client." For a moment, Elena couldn't speak. "Raul Mendoza?" she asked. He nodded. "I was his attorney once. After his death, I was tasked with cataloging the assets that were seized. The government took everything, this house, his land, his accounts. But there were rumors that he left something behind. A record, perhaps. A confession. I came because I heard that you found papers. Elena hesitated, then stepped aside. Come in, she said quietly. Inside, the light of the lamp cast their shadows long against the walls. Don Alvaro moved slowly, his steps careful, almost reverent, as if each creak of the floor reminded him of a memory best left untouched. When she handed him the diary, his fingers lingered on the cover before opening it. He turned the pages one by one, reading in silence. His expression shifted, first recognition, then disbelief, and finally something like sorrow. It's real, he murmured, his handwriting. I never thought I'd see this again. What does it mean? Elena asked. What he wrote about the house? About the children? The lawyer closed the diary and looked up at her. Before he died, Mendoza wanted to establish a trust. He called it Casa de Luz. It was meant to fund a home for children orphaned by the cartels. He wanted to use his fortune to make amends, or at least to try. But the accounts were frozen after his arrest, and the documents vanished in the confusion. If this diary is genuine, it could reopen the case. The money could be released. Elena felt a chill, though the fire still burned in the hearth. You mean, she said slowly, the house could become what he wanted it to be? Yes, Alvaro said, but it won't be easy. There will be opposition. There always is. She nodded. Then we'll try. The lawyer smiled faintly. You remind me of his wife. She had the same stubbornness. Be careful, Senora. Not everyone wants this house to have light again. He gathered his things and left before nightfall, disappearing down the wet road. For the first time in months, Elena felt a flicker of hope. She spent the evening writing a list of what she would need: supplies, repairs, paperwork. The children watched her quietly, unsure what to make of their mother's sudden determination. When Isabel asked if the ghosts were gone now, Elena smiled and said, No, but maybe they can rest. That night, as the wind rose, she found another message waiting. It was written in black paint this time, across the front steps. You can't cleanse blood with light. The words glistened in the lantern's glow, wet and fresh. She stepped back, her pulse quickening. Someone had been here again, close enough to hear them talking, close enough to paint these words on her doorstep. She didn't sleep. Every sound became a threat, the crack of wood, the brush of ivy against the windows. She sat by the fire with the diary on her lap, and the hammer Luis had used to break the wall resting within reach. The house groaned and settled as the hours passed, but she didn't move. Sometime after midnight, a sharp crack broke the quiet. The sound came from outside. She rose and crossed to the window. Something lay in the courtyard near the fountain, glinting faintly in the light. She stepped outside, the cold biting through her clothes. A rock had shattered one of the lower windows. Tied to it was a scrap of paper. Her hands shook as she untied it and unfolded it beneath the porch light. The message was short. If you don't leave, your children will pay the price. For a long moment she couldn't breathe. The night pressed close around her, dense and suffocating. She turned slowly, scanning the garden, the road beyond the gates, the black silhouettes of the trees. Nothing moved. The wind had died. Even the crickets were silent. When she finally went back inside, she locked the door and bolted it. She didn't wake the children. She didn't cry. She simply walked to the fireplace, struck a match, and held the paper over the flame. The fire consumed it quickly, curling the edges into ash. No, she whispered, her voice steady. I won't run. In the morning, the sunlight broke through the clouds, washing the hall in gold. The broken glass sparkled like frost across the floor. Outside, Luis and Isabel played in the garden, their laughter echoing faintly between the walls. Elena stood in the doorway watching them, her heart filled with both fear and resolve. The town could whisper, the shadows could threaten, but she would not surrender. That evening, she opened the diary once more. Her eyes lingered on the last line. Let this house one day belong to the innocent. As she read it, the tension that had gripped her began to ease, replaced by a strange calm. The air outside was soft and cool, carrying the scent of wet grass. Fireflies began to blink in the garden, tiny sparks of gold against the dusk. She watched them for a long time through the open window. For the first time since arriving on the hill, she didn't see them as omens or ghosts. She saw them for what they were, small, fragile lights moving bravely through the dark. Proof that even in the blackest night, something still chose to shine. Behind her, the door creaked softly in the wind, as if the house itself were listening. It no longer felt like an enemy. It felt like something waiting to be healed, like a heart learning how to beat again. And as Elena closed the diary and blew out the lamp, she realized that she had already made her decision. Whatever came next, whatever darkness still lingered beyond the gate, she would face it. The house of shadows would have light again. The next morning arrived with a brightness that felt almost foreign to the hill. The sky stretched clear and blue over San Martin for the first time since Elena could remember, as though the storm had washed not only the air, but something heavier from the land. The scent of wet grass lingered in the breeze, mingled with the faint sweetness of the jasmine that still grew along the ruined fence. Elena stood on the front steps of the mansion, her eyes following the valley below, where the town shimmered in the sunlight. For months she had seen only its cruelty, the whispers, the mocking stares, the suspicion. But today, for a brief and fragile moment, it seemed like a place she could face again. Don Alvaro had returned just after dawn, his old car coughing and grumbling as it climbed the hill. He emerged with a stack of documents in his hands and a determined expression on his lined face. "It's time," he told her simply. They sat together at the table in the library, the same one where she had first laid out the diary of Raul Mendoza. Dust motes danced in the sunlight streaming through the window as he spread the papers before her. Some bore official stamps and seals. Others were copies of bank statements, legal orders, property ledgers, all threads leading back to Mendoza's unfulfilled dream. "The accounts exist," Alvaro explained. "They were frozen after his death, but the money never disappeared. The foundation was real, Senora. All it needs now is to be reactivated." Elena listened, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Each document seemed to pulse with the weight of what was possible. A house born from violence might yet serve the living. It was a fragile idea, but it was enough. Together they began the process, signing forms, drafting petitions, gathering proof that the mansion could be more than a ruin. The lawyer's presence brought a new rhythm to her days. Letters arrived from the municipal offices, then from the Ministry of Social Affairs, and each new stamp, each signature, felt like a small victory against the curse that had clung to this house for decades. When the first group of volunteers came, 5 people from the neighboring town, Elena hardly knew how to thank them. They were an unlikely crew, a carpenter with a limp who'd once worked for Mendoza's men and wanted to make amends, a student electrician who saw the project as a way to learn, 2 women from the church who brought cleaning supplies, and a retired teacher who insisted that a library could be saved even from mold. They came with cautious eyes and left their fear at the door. Together they began the slow, almost sacred work of giving the house back its breath. Days passed filled with the sound of hammering, sweeping, sanding. The floors that had once echoed with gunfire now rang with laughter, the rhythmic scrape of brooms, and the whir of power tools. Dust fell like snow from the ceilings as old beams were replaced. The smell of polish replaced that of decay. In the afternoons, sunlight filled the halls through the newly cleaned windows, warm and golden, painting the walls in hues of forgiveness. The children helped where they could. Louis carried buckets of paint, his hands smudged white. Isabel picked flowers from the overgrown garden, arranging them in chipped vases. Even the old fountain began to stir, its basin cleared of mud and leaves. When water finally trickled through the cracks again, the sound was soft and bright, like laughter returned from a long silence. One day, as they worked to clear the lower corridor, a woman arrived from the city, a social worker named Beatrice. She was tall and calm, with sharp eyes that seemed to see both weakness and courage at once. Her voice carried authority, but there was warmth beneath it. "I've come to inspect the property," she explained. "If this place is to serve children, it must be safe." She moved through the rooms with a clipboard in hand, noting repairs and measurements. Elena followed her nervously, watching her expression for signs of approval or doubt. Beatrice paused often, touching the walls, testing the railings, opening and closing the newly fixed doors. It's strong, she finally said, and it's changing. Over coffee, she explained the requirements: permits, safety codes, emergency exits, proper sanitation. It was overwhelming, but Beatrice promised her help. People like you, she said, are the reason places like this survive. You take what was meant for darkness and make it a shelter for light. The phrase stayed with Elena long after the woman left. Soon the story began to spread. A journalist from a local newspaper came to interview her, and though she hesitated at first, Elena agreed. The article that followed was simple, almost poetic. The house that will become light. It spoke not of curses but of courage, not of ghosts but of grace. The town, once scornful, began to soften. Neighbors who had crossed the street to avoid her now came offering small things: bags of cement, jars of nails, old blankets. A baker sent bread twice a week. A teacher from the school offered to help with lessons when the home opened. And though there were still looks of distrust, the laughter that now echoed from the hill made it harder for hatred to find a foothold. But not everyone wished her well. The first anonymous letter arrived folded neatly beneath the door, written in a slanted, heavy hand. You can't wash blood with sunlight. She read it in silence and dropped it into the fire without a word. 2 nights later, another came. You're waking what should have stayed dead. This one she tore apart before the children could see it. Fear tried to find its way back into her chest, but she refused to let it live there. The house had endured worse than words. As weeks turned into months, progress became visible everywhere. The East Wing, once the darkest and most damaged, was transformed into a series of bright dormitories. The library was cleared and lined with repaired shelves. The old piano in the corner had been tuned by a volunteer who found it charmingly stubborn. When Isabel pressed a few keys, the sound was fragile but pure. Luis, growing taller by the day, painted a sun above one of the doors, its rays stretching like fingers toward the ceiling. Elena smiled when she saw it. The sun lives under the house, she whispered, remembering the drawing from the wall. And now, maybe above it too. In early autumn, the mayor himself came to visit. He arrived with a photographer and a few assistants, his polished shoes clicking against the stone floor. At first his smile was stiff, but even he seemed moved as he looked around. You've done something remarkable, he told her. The people talk about it. Perhaps this old ghost can finally rest. His handshake was firm but fleeting. He left soon after, promising to help secure the final paperwork. Elena didn't know if his words meant anything, but for the first time she didn't care. The house no longer needed permission to be alive. That night, after the visitors had gone, she sat alone in the library, the piano quiet behind her. The only sound was the wind in the shutters and the occasional drip of water in the pipes. She had left the diary open on the table. The words of Raul Mendoza no longer filled her with unease. Now they felt like part of the house itself, like beams beneath its roof. She imagined him standing in one of the doorways, watching the life that had returned, perhaps even smiling. You built your fortress on fear, she murmured, but it's become a refuge of light. It was then she heard it, the faint sound of music, a soft melody drifting from the direction of the library's piano. She turned sharply. The lamp's flame flickered, casting long shadows on the walls. No one was there. The keys moved on their own, just enough to play a few broken notes. She stood frozen, her breath caught between awe and fear. The melody stopped as suddenly as it began. The silence that followed was deep, not threatening but tender, as if the house itself had sighed. Elena sat back down slowly, her heart still racing. The children were asleep upstairs, the volunteers gone for the night. She was alone with the echoes of a place that had learned to remember kindness. Outside, the moonlight spilled through the clean windows, bathing the floor in silver. The air was cool and fragrant, alive with the smell of fresh paint and soil. She closed the diary gently and whispered, "Thank you." When she climbed the stairs to bed, she paused halfway and looked back. The light from the hallway framed the library door, and in its faint glow, she thought she saw a figure standing by the piano. A tall man, his outline blurred by shadow, his head bowed. She didn't move, and neither did he. For a long, breathless moment, they simply existed together, the living and the memory, the penitent and the keeper. Then the wind stirred the curtains, the shadow faded, and the house settled once more into peace. By dawn, the first rays of sunlight broke over the hill, touching the fountain, the windows, the walls that no longer seemed to carry their old darkness. The house of Mendoza, once a monument to fear, had begun its transformation into something radiant, something alive. The world outside might still whisper, might still doubt, but the house no longer cared. It breathed now, warm and steady, filled with laughter, footsteps, and the fragile music of hope. And beneath the foundation, deep where the light could not reach, something unseen shifted quietly, as though even the shadows were beginning to change. The morning of the opening began in stillness, the kind that feels like the world pausing before taking a new breath. The air was cool and golden, washed clean by a night of gentle rain. Elena stood at the edge of the courtyard, watching as the first rays of sunlight crept across the garden and touched the front of the house. The fountain, newly repaired, reflected the sky like a piece of glass. It was hard for her to believe that the same house which once echoed with gunfire and fear now shimmered with a kind of fragile joy. The wind carried the sound of children's laughter from the road, where the volunteers were hanging a banner between the gates. It read, in letters painted by Luis and Isabel, Casa de Luz, home for every child. Inside, the room smelled of polish and clean linen. Beds stood neatly made, shelves lined with books, tables set with plates and bread. Even the air felt lighter, as if the walls themselves had begun to breathe. The days of darkness, the nights of whispering threats, and the shadow of fear had slowly faded into memory. The town had changed too. What was once suspicion had turned, little by little, into quiet pride. The people who had mocked her now sent their children to play in the garden, or offered to help paint the walls. The newspaper had run another article, a photograph of Elena and the volunteers standing on the steps, smiling against the backdrop of the mansion reborn. The caption beneath it read, "From blood to light." Don Alvaro arrived just before noon, his hat in hand, a small smile on his tired face. He carried with him the final papers, stamped and sealed. "It's official now," he said as she met him at the gate. "The trust has been reinstated, the funds released. The house is yours, no, ours, and the foundation is recognized by the ministry. Raul Mendoza's debt is finally paid." His voice softened at the last words as though he were speaking to the man himself. Elena felt a lump rise in her throat. She nodded, unable to speak, and together they walked through the open doors into the hall that once smelled of gunpowder and now held only the perfume of sunlight. As the guests began to arrive, neighbors, officials, volunteers, and a few reporters, the courtyard filled with a low hum of voices. Children chased one another through the garden, their laughter ringing like bells. Isabel guided two of them toward the fountain, explaining that the water was magic because it had been asleep for 10 years. Luis stood by the door, proudly greeting each visitor as though he were the host. Elena watched them, her heart full in a way that made her chest ache. She had lived most of her life waiting for something to end, a struggle, a debt, a grief. But now, for the first time, she was standing at the beginning of something. Beatrice, the social worker, arrived in a crisp white blouse, her eyes bright with approval as she surveyed the transformation. "You did it," she said softly, handing Elena a clipboard with the final inspection form. "This place will help so many children. It's more than a house now, it's a promise." Elena signed her name with steady hands. Around her, conversations drifted like warm wind, voices speaking of hope, of second chances, of how something beautiful had risen from what everyone thought was ruined. When the hour of the ceremony came, the crowd gathered near the front steps. Don Alvaro stood beside Elena, holding a small pair of scissors tied with a blue ribbon. The mayor, looking uncomfortable in the sunlight, cleared his throat and spoke a few polite words about perseverance and community. But it was Elena's voice that stilled the air. "This house," she began, "was once built to keep people out. Now it opens its doors to bring them in. What was meant to hide the past will now protect the future. We don't erase what happened here. We build over it with light, with laughter, with life." She paused, her eyes glistening as she looked toward her children. "Let the sun that once hid beneath this house shine through every window." The applause that followed was not loud but warm, deep, and genuine. Luis handed his mother the scissors, and together they cut the ribbon. The sound of it snapping was soft but final, the end of one story and the beginning of another. The crowd cheered, and the gates opened wide as if the mansion itself were exhaling. As the celebration continued, Elena moved through the rooms, greeting visitors, answering questions, and accepting embraces. Children wandered the halls, their voices filling the once hollow corridors. Beatrice and the volunteers distributed food and small gifts. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, gilding everything in amber light. When the last guest had gone, and the laughter had faded into the distance, the house fell quiet again, though it was a different kind of quiet now, one filled with peace rather than emptiness. She found herself in the library as the evening settled, the windows opened to let in the cool air. The diary of Raul Mendoza rested on the table, beside the crucifix and the child's drawing she had found months before. The drawing had been framed now, its edges smoothed, the pencil sun shining over the small house below. Elena traced the words with her finger. "The sun lives under the house." She smiled softly. "It does," she whispered, "and it always will." The sound of footsteps made her turn. A man stood in the doorway, tall, silver-haired, his expression solemn. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said. "My name is Diego Mendoza. Raul was my uncle." His voice held both pride and sorrow. "I heard what you've done here. I needed to see it for myself." Elena gestured for him to enter. He moved slowly through the room, his eyes lingering on the walls, the furniture, the open piano in the corner. "He wanted to change," Diego said at last. "In the end he tried, but the world only remembered the man he had been. You've given him something he never found in life, a second chance." She didn't know what to say. "It wasn't me," she replied quietly. "It was this house. It wanted to remember something good." Diego nodded, his gaze softening. "Then it chose the right person." As the sky outside turned crimson with the setting sun, they walked together through the courtyard. The fountain glimmered with gold, and the air was filled with the hum of insects and the rustle of leaves. The mansion's windows blazed with reflected light, as if it were burning with its own quiet fire. Diego stopped at the gate, turning back once more. "My uncle used to say the sun never sets on those who try to make peace. I think he'd be proud of what you've done." Then he left, disappearing down the road that curved into the valley. When night fell, the children slept soundly in their rooms, their laughter still echoing faintly in the walls. Elena sat by the window in her small office, looking out at the moonlight spilling across the courtyard. The house was alive with whispers, the good kind now, the creak of the beams settling, the sigh of wind through the shutters, the faint hum of pipes carrying water. It no longer frightened her. Every sound was a reminder that this place, once a tomb, was now a living thing. Before she went to bed, she opened the old safe one, last time. Inside lay the diary, the crucifix, and the drawing. She placed a new photograph beside them, a picture taken that very day of Luis, Isabel, and the first children who would soon come to live there. All of them standing in the garden, with the fountain splashing behind them. She closed the safe gently, the metal cool beneath her hand. Outside, the first light of dawn began to rise again over the valley. The beams reached the house, spilling across the windows and the freshly painted sign above the door. The letters Casa de Luz caught the sun and gleamed as though they were alive. For a moment, the entire facade seemed to glow, and Elena felt it, an almost imperceptible tremor beneath her feet, like the deep exhale of something vast and ancient, finally at peace. She smiled, knowing that the stories the town would tell from now on would be different. They would no longer whisper of a cursed mansion or a ghostly drug lord. They would speak of a house that had learned to forgive itself, of a woman who believed in its redemption, of children who brought it back to life. And as she turned from the window, the light flooded through every room, touching every wall, every corner, every quiet secret hidden deep within. For a brief, shimmering moment, it seemed as if the house itself were glowing from the inside out. Proof that somewhere, in the foundations below, the sun that had long slept beneath the house had finally risen again. Suscríbete para no perderte la próxima historia. Mira ahora el siguiente video y explora más en el canal. Comparte este video con alguien a quien le gustan las historias fuertes. Cuéntame en los comentarios desde dónde lo estás viendo.